We're lucky to have a really fantastic panel this afternoon to focus on the, if you like, the nuts and bolts of construction. We've talked about the policy arena before. Now we're going to speak to four senior people in the supply chain in construction. We have Sue Arundale, who's in charge of technical environmental affairs at the European Construction Industry Federation, FIEC, that represents many of the larger contractors in Europe. From the equipment manufacturing side, we have Peter Jorgensen, who's Senior Vice President of Purchasing and Supplier Management at Volvo Construction Equipment. We have Douglas McLuckie from Ashtead Group, of course, the owner of Sunbelt Rentals, one of the largest rental companies in the world. He is in charge of environmental, social, and governance at Ashtead. And we have Michel, who you just heard talking about the CO2 calculator. Michel is the Secretary General of the European Rental Association. So I can see from the responses, 70% of you do not think that Europe's construction industry is moving quickly enough on sustainability. 30% think that the industry is doing enough. So that's really my first question to the panelists. And I'm going to start with you, Sue. What's your view on Europe's construction industry focus on sustainability, and if it's not doing enough, what's the problem? Sue.
Thank you very much. First of all, could I just say that FIEC also represents small contractors, and that although we are known for the largest companies, of course, they use a lot of smaller subcontractors. So we do represent all of the contractors in the European Union. And secondly, well, I suppose I'm not surprised to see this this result. It's a resounding no. For me, this is not a straightforward answer, but I'm going to explain why. It's partly a question of demand, of course, and contractors build according to the client's request and to the design specifications. I'm not saying that this means we are completely off the hook. In the industry as a whole, and let's include our clients in this, we could be moving faster, but there are some barriers. First of all, we have a lack of availability of secondary materials. Sometimes we have shortages, and we sometimes have problems with quality, and sometimes we are not even allowed to use secondary materials because the buyer does not want us to. Secondly, we have the question of standards and regulations. There are gaps in terms of secondary materials, and as the burden of responsibility is on the contractor, contractors need reassurance about these materials. There are also issues around safety and around fire risk and toxicity. And there are also some policy gaps. So, for example, we have to see how we can fill those policy gaps. So it's not a straightforward answer. We could be going faster, of course, but there are lots of reasons, lots of mitigating factors in this.
Thanks, Sue. But essentially, you would say that the construction sector, your members and the associations that are members of FIEC, they are committed to sustainability. They take it seriously, and they're pushing ahead with it.
Yeah, they do take it seriously. And in fact, we have lots of examples because we sometimes see companies' sustainability reports and we see what they're committed to. And the larger contractors in particular, they have very ambitious goals. So they are very committed to the principle of sustainability. As I mentioned, we are dealing with some obstacles. So we need some changes. We need things to go faster. And some of that is related to incentives. Some of that is related to demand. Some of that is related to supply of these materials and quality, but it's also related to regulations. So, but yes, I can tell you absolutely that the industry is committed to sustainability, to circularity, and also to the reduction of carbon.
Thank you. Peter Jorgensen from Volvo Construction Equipment, what's your view on this?
First of all, then, Murray, thanks for inviting me to this panel, but I was a little bit disappointed I couldn't vote in the survey there. But I agree with these 70% that say we are not moving fast enough. And I think it's hard to say that anyone is moving quickly enough. But we need to be aware about this is a huge transformation in the whole society. and the construction sector has an important role to play in this. But my answer on that is also that change takes time.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking for Volvo CE, but you have a very particular approach to sustainability in your business. Looking at the wider industry without naming names, you think some of your peers in the industry could be doing more in terms of sustainability?
I think, yeah, but also we from Volvo, even if we have quite heritage about safety and sustainability within Volvo, I think we can do more, all of us.
Okay, thank you. Douglas, from the equipment rental perspective, is the industry doing enough?
I think it's clear that the attendees, the poll there has came along, Murray, to state no. I think there is a huge challenge between now and the 2040, 2050 scenario within the Paris Climate Agreement there. I think that my personal reason behind it is clients' willingness to pay for better, more advanced technology. So in essence, we are all, we all have a burden on us that we all want products cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And therefore, from the client's perspective, we are forcing industry to make things less expensive. And by that definition, then we're going to start outsourcing and get less desirable products into the marketplace. So, for me, looking at some of the blue chip clients, they are absolutely at the top of their game when it comes to sustainability, and they are willing to pay that premium to ensure sustainability and the overall build cost of a project. Some clients just haven't quite grasped that concept yet.
Okay, thank you. Michel, your organization represents the interests of the rental sector. You're focused on sustainability through the CO2 Calculator and the circular economy, promoting rental as a core part of the circular economy. Is the rental industry doing enough?
You mentioned the CO2 calculator, but we have developed over the last 3-5 years quite a few other projects. We have developed a project called Sustainable Supplier Framework, which is an attempt to help any stakeholder, and particularly among the suppliers, service suppliers, to evaluate their equipment suppliers, let's say the OEMs, when it comes to sustainability. And we have developed that among all the companies involved, including service companies like rental companies, but also contractors, also OEMs. And it's a good tool to increase the awareness of the relation with their suppliers when it comes to sustainability. We have developed another project which is called Csr Kpis, which means that we have used some consultants going through all our companies and also OEMs and contractors to analyze and list the main parameters influencing CSR policies. So we have developed in 8 chapters a list of parameters indicating some basic, let's say, minimum requirements, some good practice, and for the leading operators, some best practice. So those are tools that we are developing all together, involving not only the rental companies, but also the upstream and downstream. And that's our way of contributing to the improvement of the situation.
Yeah. Michel, those tools, are they a function of demand from your members? The members want these tools, or is it a top-down thing where you're thinking, what can we do to make our industry more sustainable? Is it driven by your members or driven by the association?
It's driven by our members. Actually, the Sustainable Supplier Framework was, we were invited by one of our members to think about it. We submitted it to our committees, and it was approved as a good way of improving the situation. The same thing for Csr Kpis. So it doesn't come from ERA. ERA is nothing less than all our members, is made of our active members operating.
Yeah.
Operators and so on.
Thank you. We'll talk a little more about this CO2 calculator later. Sue, I want to come back to you and ask about, obviously an enormous component of CO2 emissions is generated by the materials that your members are using when they're constructing buildings. And the supply chain and the interaction that the contractors have with the supply chain is obviously an important part of this question. What are the construction contractors doing with their supply chain to try and encourage sustainability?
Yeah, so first of all, again, I refer to the demands of the client and the architect in terms of the choice of materials. However, I mentioned that large contractors do have ambitious goals for sustainability, and indeed, these contractors do have influence, particularly the bigger ones. So they have leverage over their supply chains, and they're able to make an effort on this in this regard. We have some examples. For example, we know of one company that is using its asphalt. 90% of its asphalt is made from previously used building materials. We have another one that insists on having materials only from sustainable sources. So they are doing things. In reality, the smaller contractors have more difficulty in influencing their supply chains, but definitely the desire and the will is there. I should also mention, though, that alongside what contractors do themselves, the regulatory framework is changing. And although there are national differences, so the gains might not be comparable across the member states, we are going through some big changes in terms of regulation. And this is likely to support the contractors because it's likely to make life easier for us and take away some of the obstacles that I was mentioning earlier, like the quality of secondary materials.
Thank you. And what about pricing? I guess it's like electric cars or electric construction equipment. The pricing tends to be higher. If you're talking about sustainable products in construction, are you facing the same issue?
Well, actually, we've heard both. In the main, I've heard that secondary materials are more expensive. So contractors have to take this into account. But we've also heard the other side of the argument where some materials, secondary materials, are cheaper. So I'm hearing a mixed story on this. But I think that going back to what I heard previously, the client has to be willing to go along with the contractor in this fight for sustainability. And that means that clients also have to be prepared to pick up some extra cost in some cases. This applies particularly in the field of energy efficiency, where zero energy buildings are more expensive. So clients need to be aware of that, and they need to help us.
And the renovation wave, we were hearing earlier that the amount of renovation work will double over the next decade. That is obviously going to have a big impact on your members' activity. Are they prepared for that? And what impact does that have on sustainability? Well,
the renovation wave, we're very much looking forward to it because we believe that this will stimulate the member states and help them to get the policies right to make renovation wave happen. We will have some challenges, of course, because we need to have a workforce to be able to deliver the renovation wave. And we've had challenges because of COVID, but these will also continue in terms of skills and the availability of the skilled workforce to deliver the renovation wave. So we are gearing up, but we have got some challenges to address in order to be completely ready for this renovation wave.
Thank you. Peter, let's move back to the manufacturing side. I know that Volvo has been progressive in its development of sustainable products. Can you tell us a little about what you're doing, what your strategy is?
I can do that, but first I would like to start and that we talked about sustainability, and we are actively working with the sustainability and circularity, of course. For us, it's on the top of the agenda, for sure. And it's also embedded in our purpose, building a better world. So we have set up very strong ambition for ourselves. Then I talk about the Paris Agreement alignment. I talk about the science-based targets and the electrified machines and concepts. And behind me, you can see some of these electrified machines that we launched in November last year. And you can see the compact excavator and you can see the compact wheel loaders. And I'm a little bit surprised that there is quite few of them. We are producing one of these each per day now. Then you can talk about an annual volume of 400 to 500. So I think that we need to step up. But as I said in the beginning there, change take time. But also what I said, that we have a strong heritage within Volvo about sustainability and safety. I don't know if you remember our CEO in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Per G. Gyllenhammar. He said that we are a part of the problem, but also a part of the solution. I think that's also a strong heritage that we have on our agenda. But also to mention what our CEO today said, Martin Lundstedt, when he got interviewed when he started in Volvo in 2015, he got a question then about sustainability. And it was about what does sustainability means to companies? And he said, yesterday it was an advantage. Today it is to be more competitive. Tomorrow is to survive.
Yeah. Peter, to what extent are you responding to customer demand, and to what extent is it self-generated, this strategy? I get the feeling, because you're more progressive than most manufacturers of construction equipment, I get the feeling you're maybe ahead of the curve, even ahead of your customers. Is that true?
As you said then, or I said there, change takes time, and I think we didn't wait for any legislation to do here. I think it was important for us to be in this segment and be the first one on the market. And right now we are beginning to use transition then when it comes to diesel-powered drivelines to electrical. We don't develop any more of the combustion engines for these smaller machines. That we have stopped. So now we concentrate on the electric drivelines. But of course, some of our customers are pushing that for new technologies, while others are not. But that's about the matureness, and I can say in Europe it's more mature than in other areas, I would say. So a mix of both. Okay,
we've actually had a very specific question come in about your equipment. When does Volvo see that large electrical excavators becoming available, the big sizes over to the 20 or 30 tons? I mean, you're still going to need combustion engines for those, aren't you?
No, but let's come back to that question, Mara, because I would like to touch a topic also on the machines that you see behind me then. And you asked about customers, if they are forced us to develop here. And I would say that some cities are driving this to be a green city. And I would say, our neighbor here in Sweden, our Norwegian neighbor, and the capital of Norway, Oslo, this is one of these cities that are driving this change. Going back to your question about the big machines, then, yeah, I would say that, of course, that needs to be developed now. And fuel cells is for us the way to go here. But it's not developed enough in this big scale yet. And this is why we have started a joint venture with Daimler. And also the collaboration with Shell, because here we talk about the ecosystem that needs to be in place. As we see the electrification journey, it's about both these technologies with batteries and fuel cells, of course. And there are two factors to consider here. Is the hydrogen, if I say the rule of thumb then, it's the hydrogen for the bigger machines and batteries for the smaller machines. And then I talk about certain sectors as agriculture and cities that you can see behind me.
Yeah. So even for the larger machines, hydrogen is going to work? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that it needs to be hybrid going into the bigger machines. Yes.
And over what period? I mean, we're talking 10 years or 5 years?
I would say that somewhere there between.
Yeah, okay.
When we say that we have scaled up.
Yeah, I understand.
Mm.
Let's move to Douglas and Michel in the rental sector. I suppose, Douglas, you're an enormous business. You're investing heavily in equipment every year. It's a challenge for you to switch your fleets from traditional diesel to greener technologies. And I guess you also have to overcome maybe resistance amongst your customers. How are you managing that process?
That's a great question, Murray. I think from our perspective, looking at the switch from traditional combustion engines to electrification, I foresee a perfect storm on the horizon. And the challenge is one that Michel touched on, is electricity supply. And when we look at the exponential growth of electric vehicles for delivery purposes, and then the growth in electrification of rental assets, we need to ensure that the correct supply is available to charge both those types of assets. And if we're not careful, then we're going to run out of capacity on the electricity grid to make sure we can not only charge rental assets, but charge delivery assets as well. Now, when you look at the size of our fleet, we have a huge electrified fleet at this moment in time. It's absolutely huge. And we need to map carefully any new facilities we have with regards to the electricity supply that's coming in. There is a huge challenge there. But you also touched on it, there is life left in diesel. There is no doubt about that. Because although we have lots of blue chip customers, we also satisfy the needs of the smaller individual 1, 2, 3 man size companies that support local infrastructure and local communities, and they're not willing to pay the extra premium for that electrified product. So there is still life in diesel. However, there is solutions coming through, such as new and innovative technologies, such as what Peter has touched on, is hydrogen. Hydrogen absolutely will be a fuel of the future. There is no doubt about that. And not just in the larger machines that Peter has touched on, there will be available in the smaller machines also. So, and from a customer expectation point is they need to be willing to pay an extra premium for sustainability. That will happen. There is a lot of R&D costs at this moment in time being absorbed. Peter will tell you that more than I am at this moment in time. And therefore, that is passed on to us. And if we look at the size of rental penetration, especially here in the UK, 80% rental penetration, we have lots of clout and influence with the OEMs to ensure there is a steady pace of new and innovative technologies coming through the marketplace. And we are pushing that. There is no doubt about it. We are listening to our customers and speaking to the manufacturers. That's
interesting. You talk about the clout that rental companies have as big customers. We're not talking about Volvo here. Are we generally speaking, is the industry, the manufacturers, are they doing enough to develop green products?
Absolutely, there is no doubt about it, Murray. We are seeing, Peter's touched on that there's almost no R&D budget for the smaller internal combustion engines now. That's almost gone. That I can see that across all of the manufacturers we deal with at this moment in time. When we get back to meeting face to face at the rental shows, the last rental show, I did ask the question in Coventry at the rental show there. I asked a number of the suppliers, what is your R&D budget for internal combustion engines? And for the smaller tools, every one of them said the same that Peter has. There is no budget left in it anymore. So that transition for the smaller tools perspective is already happened. I think that happened 3-4 years ago. We are now looking at the 2.5 ton upwards machines now, and how can we change that? But once again, I say that perfect storm that has to be, we need to be cognizant of, it's not just rental assets, it's delivery assets as well. And therefore, we need to make sure there's capacity in the electricity supply to support both those types of assets and charging.
Thank you. in the same way that you have clout with the manufacturers, I guess the contractors have clout with you in terms of driving your behavior. So going back to Sue, so to what extent do contractors in Europe view the sustainability or the sustainability credentials of their suppliers, like rental companies, when they're choosing their subcontractors?
Well, they do. Oh, I can hear an echo.
We can hear you okay. I think carry on.
Okay. It depends on the contractor, of course, and in particular the size of the company. And I mentioned earlier that the position of SMEs is different to larger companies. They don't necessarily have the time to check their suppliers. But the larger contractors in particular, and some of the ones that I spoke to before this event, told me that they are indeed checking the green credentials of their suppliers, and it's important, and it has influence in their decision.
Thank you. Michel, we talked earlier about the circular economy and how rental plays into that concept. Is the ERA and is the rental sector making enough of that argument when they're dealing with customers, do you think?
I think so. It's precisely that's when in 2017 we became aware of looking deeply at the position of the rental industry or the rental activity within that circular paradigm, circular economic paradigm. And we went deep in the analysis. We collected a lot of inputs from operators, from different stakeholders. And that's when we discovered that we could identify some parameters, some clear parameters influencing the carbon footprint of equipment. Now, to answer your question, our philosophy at ERA is really to serve our industry at large. And we are open, by the way, not only to rental companies, but also to all kinds of suppliers, mainly OEMs, of course. And our philosophy is to somehow collect the best practice, which comes mostly from the large companies, but there are also small companies providing very innovative processes, innovative situations. So we look at everything we could, we collect those best practice, we put it in shape, as I said before, with those deliverables, and we try to spread them around the industry, because as Sue says before, if the construction industry is very, very much spread in small companies, it's the same for the service companies as well as the distribution companies. So we have a lot of small companies which Rental National Association take care of. So we are very close in working with the national associations, which are, by the way, members of ERA, to make sure that we can spread those deliverables throughout the whole industry. So that's our way of participating. That's what I call creating value for the industry.
Thank you, Michel. We have some questions coming in, and I'm keen to get some answers on them. So there's a couple of questions here for you, Peter. Can you speak a little about Volvo's approach to dealing with machinery once it reaches the end of its life? What is the circular approach there? And I guess we can ask Douglas that question as well, but let's start with you, Peter.
Yeah, and of course, circularity is so important. I think there is someone that is not muted, so please mute. I would say that circularity is so important, of course, and we are working with that continuously. And when we talk about, we have something that we call reman, and that is the remanufacturing. Then when we are into new technologies, we have set up a new business area within Volvo now quite recently, and that's about VAS, but also energy, Volvo Energy, where we think you can have this circularity in the batteries, as an example now, when we go into batteries for electrified machines.
Thank you. Douglas, obviously, A-Plant, you're a Sunbelt, you're an asset manager as one of your roles. What happens to machines at the end of the life? Is it something that concerns you?
It really doesn't concern us, Murray, because the key thing we have within rental is we remarket our products. We only keep them for about 3/4 of their useful economic life. So therefore, so that we can bring new and innovative technologies in at the front end, we exit those technologies after 5, 6, 7, 10 years at the back end, and they go on to have another useful life elsewhere, whether that be in new and emerging countries or whether it be as parts for other products. Then, you know, it really doesn't concern us from a rental perspective, just down to the useful economic life within the rental portfolio.
Got it, thank you. Another question, how do we balance the green and health agendas, removing carbon, but also reducing harmful emissions in terms of noise and also particulate matter and CO2? Who would like to answer that question?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to answer that one, Murray. When we look at the new and emerging technologies that's coming through, we look at the tiers of the engines that we have. We're now on the tier 5s and tier 6 engines and moving forward, aren't we? So therefore, we look at the particulate matter that was emitted 10 years ago compared to where it is just now. It's beyond comparable when we look at the reductions. It is quite amazing, because where innovation, and Peter from a manufacturer will testify to this, where we have focused on reducing carbon, there's been a natural drag downwards towards reducing particulate matter 10s, the NOx and the SOx of this world as well, regards to nitrous and sulfur dioxide emissions. It's just been a natural evolution in the process. And when we look at and we absolutely map our emissions, as we can see an exponential downward trend in those emissions, which will help society as a whole from a health perspective. You know, if you look at AdBlue, for example, has been a great example of reducing, you know, those types of emissions that we add into diesel engines. We never added in up to even 3 or 4 years ago. So there's been a great downward trend there.
Thanks, Douglas. You know, we're over our time, but I think there's still a few things we can continue to discuss. So let's carry on for a few minutes at least. And I want to talk a little about the CO2 calculator, Michel, and maybe you as well, Douglas. Michel, is there anything surprising come out of the CO2 calculator in terms of how rental companies can adjust the way they do things to help sustainability?
Yes, it's a good question. I already provided some partial answers. Yes, we discovered that there are some parameters very much influencing the total carbon footprint of the equipment. But I would like to come back on why we did a CO2 calculator. It was as a consequence of looking at how could we contribute to improving the carbon footprint situation. And so we took from the start a quite holistic approach, not thinking on ourselves, but thinking on the equipment itself, and going from upstream, from the manufacturers, to downstream, to not only the contractors, but the end customers, which owns the buildings, which owns the roads and bridges. So because those are the one to propose reductions of carbon footprint at the end of the day, and it translates to the contractors, and then to the service suppliers, and then to the OEMs. Because our CO2 calculator today, it makes quite some noise because it's a kind of first of its kind, but it's a rough calculator. I would qualify that a rough calculator, because if we have defined after 3 years of working the very solid parameters and elements of what constitute the total carbon footprint of the equipment, we have to go back and now to work hard at complementing and refining. I could just mention some of those. In the definition and the production, for example, we have to add the impact of production in different countries, especially for batteries and so on. In lifetime, we are based on operating hours, but we have now to consider idle hours, because idle hours have low consumption, but they may represent up to 40–50% of the total running hours. So we have to add that. In energy, I said it before, but we have to distinguish the type of engine, stage 4, stage 5, and so on. We have to account for hybrid machines and other alternative fuel. It's very complicated matter. We have to enter deep into that. In maintenance, we have been very simplistic so far. We have to add filters, hoses, and someday spare parts, and so on and so on. That's for the scope and content of the calculator itself. Now, the main point is that we did it for the use, the final use, and to help the whole situation, which means that we have a lot of requests now to make it more user-friendly, meaning our stakeholders would like to allow for calculation for multiple pieces of equipment to determine carbon footprint of a whole fleet or a job site in aggregated dashboard, for example, and so on, so on. So we are collecting right now all the feedbacks, and we'll go back and open up probably new projects to go further. Some people consider it too complicated today. It won't be more complicated. It will be more performing and more user-friendly, but it's going to take time.
Thanks, Michel. Just a quick answer, if you don't mind. What kind of feedback have you had from people actually using it? Is there a big take-up, a rapid take-up? Have you been monitoring how many people are using it? And is it mainly rental companies or also contractors?
The surprise is that from the feedback we had, some world-leading manufacturers are using it daily. And I say world-leading manufacturers, and I could name, I won't, but I could name 3 of them. And we had them in a committee recently, and they are using it daily. So everybody is involved. And it's like our TCO calculator, our total cost of ownership. When we look at Google Analytics, we have 1/3 of contractors, 1/3 of suppliers, rental companies, and 1/3 of OEMs, which means that we are interesting all the value chain of the equipment.
Thank you. I want to broaden out at the end again, but before we do that, Douglas, I want to ask you about, I know that I was reading the Ashtead ESG report, and I know that you measure obviously your own CO2 output, but you take a different approach when it comes to the actual use of equipment by your customers. And I'm just interested what lies behind that kind of strategy.
That's a great Murray. So when we look at our own scope 1 and 2 emissions, we have managed and measured those for over 10 years now, and also publicly report under the Carbon Disclosure Project. With regards to our customers' usage of the equipment and the scope 3, we have now engaged a program to measure our scope 3 emissions so we can understand the upstream and downstream impacts and report them as part of our strategy. So clearly we touched earlier on, I think it was mentioned with regards to science-based targets and understanding how we as a company can support the overall carbon budget and reduce those emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. So we absolutely measure scope 1 and 2, report publicly on them, and we are now looking at scope 3 emissions and the use of the equipment itself, as well as the manufacturing and basically the whole life cycle impact of the asset in itself.
So scope 3, you'll be using the CO2 calculator to help you do that?
The challenge you have is that, as Michel had touched on, the Scope3 calculator is in its infancy. It still has to be built out with regards to look at whole fleets. There is no doubt about it. It's a fantastic tool in supporting an argument for me that is very crucial. Everyone looks at the total cost of ownership as an economic impact. I think what the calculator does is support there is a carbon budget as well. And a lot of people miss that fact. Once we get the mindsets round, there is a fiscal impact as well as a carbon impact, then we can move towards rental as being supporting more for that drive towards transition in a low carbon economy.
Thank you. That's interesting. Can I ask all the panelists for their view on what the impact of the pandemic will have on sustainability? It's easy to imagine that in a recovery phase that sustainability will be the focus, but economies are weak. Cash is low. Can we really expect the pandemic, the post-pandemic world, to focus more on sustainability? Realistically, Sue?
Well, things will change, but honestly, I don't think this is a question of the pandemic. It's changing because of the legislative framework. So the Green Deal, the revision of the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, we're expecting a carbon price for the use phase of buildings, and they're revising the Construction Products Regulation. When you add on top of this, that sustainable finance will be subject to taxonomy criteria. This is a really big deal, really big thing that's happening right now. So this is going to have a massive impact in terms of what is financed, what is subsidized. And so things are going to change dramatically. But as I say, I don't think this is because of the pandemic, they're changing anyway.
Peter?
Yeah, I can add there. I agree with you, but maybe the pandemic was an eye-opener or pushed it a little bit further then. So it started earlier, but of course it had been on the agenda and it will move forward dramatically fast now, I hope and I think. But I think the pandemic was an eye-opener and forced us or pushed us to make it possible earlier.
Thank you, Peter. Michel, you first in response to that, and then Douglas.
I should respond.
Yeah, Michel, on the impact of the pandemic, rental companies have to invest, but it's a difficult time to invest because of the economy.
There are two kinds of answer. First of all, on a generic answer, the equipment rental industry, as everybody knows, is an asset-based business model. It takes very roughly, and I don't take specialty, but it takes €2 to generate €1 revenue. So it's a very heavy capitalized business. And from what we know now, the rental companies have resisted quite well throughout the crisis so far in trying to keep their assets current and up to work. So they are ready to take up on the work when it comes back, and they will wait as long as it takes, but they are ready and they will be there and to take sales opportunities for a new actions. But the second type of answer is we noticed that the situation of the companies have been very different based on the countries, depending on the way the pandemic has been managed by the authorities. So some countries have maintained construction work for the crisis, some have don't. And that has meant quite some difference for the year 2020 at least, and we'll see for 2021. That's basically what it is.
Thank you. Douglas?
I think for me, Murray, society has changed significantly over the pandemic. And if there's one light at the end of the tunnel that's going to come out of it, is that we all have a different mindset when it comes to sustainability. Peter touched on it. For me, this started 4 or 5 years ago, the push. I think the pandemic has accelerated it. And as we come out, then I think there'll be a huge focus on how we can support, not just locally with regards to the communities, but with regards to our global impact as well. And I don't think that will change. The other point you made with regards to Michel and the rental companies is, and you mentioned, Murray, about a cash conservation. Well, clearly the rental model is absolutely prime position to support that when it comes to that pent up demand to build out as we grow more sustainably. And what better way to do it than support the rental model, conserve your cash and actually support the circular economy and rent.
Thank you, Douglas. That's a nice way to end with a promotion of the rental business and the circular economy. I'm going to hand back to Carol Bachman of ERA now, but before I do that, I want to thank again our panelists. I think they've done a fantastic job. Sue Arundale of FIEC, Peter Jorgensen from Volvo CE, Douglas McLuckie from Ashtead Group, and Michel Petitjean from ERA. Thank you again, and thanks for asking me to moderate the panel.